5:32 में कहा गया मनुस्मृति में कि खुदा ने कुछ जानवर बनाए खाने के लिए और कुछ खुराक बनने के लिए। अगर खुराक बनने वाले जानवर खा जाते खाने वाले जानवर के जरिए तो ये गुनाह नहीं है। आगे लिखा है मनुस्मृति चैप्टर नंबर 5 श्लोका नंबर 30 में कि अगर आप खाने वाले जानवर खाते हैं तो गुनाह नहीं है। मनुस्मृति चैप्टर नंबर 5 वर्ष नंबर 40 में कहा गया है कि कुछ जानवर कुर्बानी के लिए बनाए गए। अगर आप कुर्बानी के जानवर का कत्ल करते तो गुनाह नहीं है। अगर आप पढ़ेंगे महाभारत अनुशासन पर्व चैप्टर नंबर 88 में, उसके अंदर युधिष्ठिर पांडव के बड़े भाई वो बीच में से पूछते हैं कि हमारे जो पुरखे एंसेस्टर्स जो मर गए उनको सुकून पहुंचाने के लिए हम यज्ञ में पूजा में क्या दे। तो भीष्म कहता है अगर आप भाजी पाला देंगे तो हमारे बाप दादा 1 महीने के लिए संतुष्ट रहेंगे। अगर आप मछली देंगे 2 महीना, अगर गोश्त देंगे 3 महीना, अगर आप रैबिट खरगोश देंगे 4 महीना, अगर बकरी देंगे तो 5 महीना, अगर आप सुअर देंगे 6 महीना, अगर आप परिंदे देंगे 7 महीना, अगर डियर देंगे हिरन 8 महीना। और ये पूरा मेन्यू है, लंबा मेन्यू है। अगर आप बफेलो देंगे बफेलो तो 11 महीना। अगर आप गाय ज़बह करेंगे 1 साल तक आपके दादा परदादा संतुष्ट रहेंगे। 1 साल। कौन कहता है? भीष्म युधिष्ठिर थे महाभारत में अनुशासन पर चैप्टर नंबर 88 में पूरा मेन्यू है। वेद में कई जगह लिखा है कि साधु संत गोश्त खाते थे, गाय भी खाते थे। तो इससे यह मालूम पड़ता है कि हिंदू धर्म में गोश्त खाने की ममानियत नहीं है। लेकिन कुछ मजहब है जो कहते हैं कि भाई जीवित को नहीं मानना चाहिए, मिसाल के तौर पर जैनिज्म एक्सेट्रा, और वो ये प्रचार करते हैं कि कोई भी जानवर का कत्ल नहीं करना चाहिए, इसीलिए गोश्त खाना हराम है। तो मैं कहता हूँ अभी साइंस एडवांस हो चुकी है, हम जानते हैं कि पेड़ पौधे में भी जान है, वो भी जीवित है, तो आप पेड़ पौधा क्यों खाते? नहीं नहीं, अभी लॉजिक चेंज हो गया। उनको पहले पता नहीं था ना, सैकड़ों साल पहले हमें क्या पता था पेड़ पौधे के अंदर भी जान है। वो लॉजिक उस टाइम सही थी, अभी साइंस बढ़ गई तो उनकी लॉजिक बदल गई। अभी कहते नहीं आखिर भाई पेड़ पौधे में जान नहीं चलेगा, लेकिन पेड़ पौधे को दर्द नहीं होता, जानवर को दर्द होता है। पेड़ पौधे जीवित है लेकिन दर्द नहीं होता, इसीलिए पेड़ पौधे खा सकते हैं। आज की रिसर्च कहती है कि इवन द प्लांट कैन फील पेन, लेकिन वो जब चिल्लाते हैं हम इंसान उसे सुन नहीं सकते, क्योंकि इंसान सिर्फ 20 साइकिल और 20,000 साइकिल पर सेकेंड के दरमियान में सुन सकते, उसके नीचे ऊपर नहीं सुन सकते। अमेरिका में एक फार्मर था जिसने ऐसा इक्विपमेंट बनाया जब पेड़ को पौधे को पानी की जरूरत तो चिल्लाता था, वो कन्वर्ट होता था बिटवीन 20,000 साइकिल, उसे फौरन पता चला पानी देता था। अभी उनकी लॉजिक चेंज हो गई। आखिर मानते हैं कि पेड़ पौधे में जान है, उन्हें दर्द का एहसास है, लेकिन पेड़ पौधे में 2 सेंसेस कम है, जानवर में 5 सेंसेस है, पेड़ में 3 सेंसेस है, इसीलिए पेड़ पौधे खाना जायज है। मिसाल के तौर पे आर्ग्यूमेंट एक पे बात उसकी मान भी लूं, जो नहीं मानता हूं मैं, मान भी लूं, और अगर मैं तस्लीम भी करता हूँ फॉर आर्ग्यूमेंट कि पेड़ पौधे में 3 सेंस है, जानवर में 5 सेंस है। मैं आपसे पूछना चाहता हूँ, अगर आपका भाई पैदा होता है गूंगा और बहरा, बोल नहीं सकता है, सुन नहीं सकता है, वो बड़ा होता है और एक आदमी उसका कत्ल करता है, आप जाके बोलेंगे जज को, मिलोड ये कातिल को जरा कम सजा देना क्योंकि मेरा भाई गूंगा था और बहरा था, आप ऐसा कहेंगे? आप कहेंगे जज कातिल को डबल पनिशमेंट दो, बेचारे ने गूंगे और बहरे को मारा, कहेंगे क्या नहीं? तो लॉजिक डजंट वांट 2 सेंटेंस कम या 2 सेंटेंस ज्यादा। कुरान में लिखा है वो चीज को खाओ जो आपके लिए हलाल है, जो चीज आपको खाने की इजाजत है वो खा सकते हैं, जो आपके लिए अच्छा है खा सकते हैं, बाकी हराम है। मुझे जाती तौर पे कोई गिला शिकवा नहीं, अगर कोई गैर मुसलमान गोश्त नहीं खाता मुझे कोई गिला शिकवा नहीं। अगर हिंदुस्तान में गैर मुसलमान सारे हिंदू गोश्त खाने लगेंगे तो गोश्त का भाव भी बढ़ जाएगा। तो मुझे कोई जाती तौर पे गिला शिकवा नहीं, लेकिन कोई अगर जबरदस्ती मुझे कहता है कि तुम हराम कर रहे गुनाह कर रहे तो मैं जवाब देता है, जाती तौर पे मुझे कोई। इसीलिए इस्लाम में लिखा है कि बिना वजह किसी का कत्ल मत करो। मिसाल के तौर पे आप अगर गोट बकरी को कत्ल कर रहे, ज़बा करते को बिस्मिल्लाह, अल्लाह अकबर, अल्लाह के नाम से जो महान है। लेकिन अगर मैं शिकार के लिए शिकार करता हूँ, निशानेबाजी के लिए तो जानवर का कत्ल करना हराम है। लेकिन मैं खाने के लिए कत्ल करता हूँ तो इजाजत है। निशानेबाजी के लिए मैं परिंदे को, पिजिन को, कबूतर को मारता हूँ, हराम है। आप समझे ना, खाली अपने शौक को पूरा करने के लिए। लेकिन जबान को अच्छा रखने के लिए, जीने के लिए जायज है। चाहे पेड़ पौधों, अगर आप कहेंगे कोई भी जीवित चीज को नहीं मारना चाहिए, मैं आपके साथ हूं, लेकिन ये मुमकिन ही नहीं है। खाना छोड़ो, सांस लेना मुमकिन नहीं। मैंने खाना पहले, आप सांस खाना तो छोड़िए, आप खड़े नहीं रह सकते 10 मिनट तक के बिना कोई जीवित चीज को मार के। तो इस्लाम एक लॉजिकल मजहब है। ये सब चीजें जो आपकी दलील है ना, 200 साल पहले हो सकता है कि कोई वजन कैरी करते, आज साइंस आगे बढ़ चुका है। उस टाइम के लिए सही था, शायद आपकी कोई बात मान लेता था। आज साइंस एडवांस हो चुका है। इस्लाम जो है पहले के लिए, अभी के लिए, ता क़यामत तक है। इसीलिए इस्लाम में अपने हाथ को खाली निशानेबाजी के लिए नहीं, लेकिन खाने के लिए किसी का कत्ल करते, जो खाने की चीज की इजाजत है तो ये आपके लिए हलाल है, चाहे पेड़ पौधा हो, चाहे बकरी हो, चाहे कोई भी खाना हो। होप दैट आंसर्स द क्वेश्चन।
The fact that he calls every Muslim in the world untrustworthy, says everybody who identifies as Muslim is a predator, compares Muslims to animals. He is not a serious human being, and you can see the utter bigotry in every word.
I speak from the authority of the universe, that Iran and all its proxies and the Muslim world behind it, there is going to be only the language of fire.
Iran will respond, I have no doubt about that, and the Israeli regime will be punished.
For decades, Iran has used its militia to antagonize Israel by proxy and to protect itself from its sworn enemy, the United States. That strategy has now been obliterated, along with Hezbollah's entire chain of command. Its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed in an enormous strike in his headquarters in Beirut on Friday. The assassination has been 18 years in the making. You would know, though, from some of the commentary this weekend, that Nasrallah was a terrorist. He propped up Assad's murderous regime in Syria. He trained fighters in Hamas, as well as violent militias in Iraq and Yemen. He ordered strikes on Israel in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. The world is a better place without it. Is it safer? Could a humiliated Iran decide that a nuclear bomb is now the only recourse for defense? Israel has announced that it intends to launch a ground incursion into Lebanon, and it could start as early as today. Meanwhile, 1 million Lebanese have already been displaced by the escalating conflict, which is 1/5 of the entire population. The civilian death toll is rising. The war in Gaza rages on. Nasrallah has met a deservedly grim end, but the crisis in the Middle East may have only just begun. In a moment, I'll be speaking to the Iranian-American academic, Professor Mohammed Morandi, who's in Beirut. But first, returning to Uncensored to discuss the fallout, the son of Hamas's founder and former Palestinian militant Mossad Hassan Youssef, and the Palestinian-American commentator Omar Badr. Welcome to both of you. Mossad, let me start with you. Your response to the killing of Hassan Nasrallah?
Well, you know, Hassan Nasrallah, his hands are stained with blood, not only Jewish blood, but also Arab blood. He participated in the killing of hundreds of thousands of Syrians along the Russian forces and along Bashar al-Assad forces. This man has been, or had been, destabilizing the security of the Middle East, and this was the time to put an end for this greed and this blackmailing and this act of terror.
I mean, Omar Badr, are you sorry that he's dead?
Piers, before I answer your question, I think there's something that your audience has to know about Musab, who's on this program. If we can see if he's going to be able to control his temper and keep me from telling the audience this about him, is the fact that he calls every Muslim in the world untrustworthy, says you can't trust any Muslim, says everybody who identifies as Muslim is a predator, compares Muslims to animals, and the list goes on and on and on. And Piers, I think both of us know that if anybody engaged in that kind of bigotry towards, say, Jews, you would not give them airtime to appear on a program as if they're a real analyst who's here with something to say. And on top of these deeply bigoted views that he holds, there's also the fact that he is simply just not a serious person. You know, puts on this really dumb, put-on angry face and barks incredibly shallow slogans about Israel being wonderful and its opponents being terrible and terrorists and so on. It's not really a real point of analysis. With that being at the forefront, I'll say that I think what Israel did and Lebanon was doing is, don't take my word for it, listen to what Israeli leaders themselves have said about the assassination of Nasrallah. They said they could have and wanted to reach a diplomatic agreement with Hassan Nasrallah, but his insistence on ending the genocide in Gaza as a precondition to them reaching a diplomatic solution led them to choose to assassinate him and killing hundreds of Lebanese civilians in the process, incinerating entire apartment buildings. So in essence, Israel is choosing to incinerate Lebanese civilians, to assassinate Nasrallah because they don't want peace in Gaza. That is the dynamic that we have. And the fact that you can look at this and still not figure out what moral policy should be and who's to blame for this kind of path of escalation that we're on, to me is completely mind-boggling. It is obvious that Israel is out of control. It's on a warpath.
All right, look, you've launched a substantive ad hoc attack on your other panelists, which is entirely your prerogative, you can respond. You also failed to answer my simple question. Are you sorry he's dead?
I look at it in terms of the impact on civilians, which in this case, I think his assassination has made things infinitely more dangerous. We're seeing this onslaught, so yes, this is development.
Yeah, but
is not a
Omar, that's
positive
not actually an
one.
answer to my question. Do you personally feel sorry that he is dead, the head of Hezbollah?
No, look, but that's the thing. I don't have individual personal feelings about players here. For me, what I'm concerned about is ultimately the impact on innocent people. Absolutely. Look, Nasrallah, if you want me to talk about his legacy, that's a really easy thing to do. He was a hero throughout the entire Arab world for having driven Israel out of South Lebanon in 2000, for delivering Israel its first defeat in 2006, and then his record, had a major blemish on it when he intervened in the Syrian civil war for geopolitical reasons on the side of the government, and that upset a lot of Syrians who are essentially repressed and brutalized by the Syrian government to see that he has intervened in order to help them maintain power. But that was more a geopolitical decision more than it is a moral decision. And so he has a mixed record, and a lot of people like him and a lot of people don't. But ultimately, there's no question about the fact that he is a major figure in the region that has a significant fan base, not just within Lebanon, but throughout the entire region. And that taking this major escalatory step, when we've had the alternative, we've had the option of a ceasefire, and Israel chose not to take that and chose the path of escalation and taking out a major figure, is obviously pushing us towards further catastrophe. And it's materializing right now in Lebanon as we're watching Israeli terrorism decimate the civilian population in all parts of Lebanon, and that's a really, really dangerous escalation.
Okay, Mossab, first of all, your response to the personal attack that was launched on you at the start of that.
I'm not going to comment on that. I know who I am, I know what I am. I'm not a commentator on the Middle Eastern
conflict. By your own admission.
I lived the conflict. I witnessed, I'm an eyewitness. I lived half of my life in what's so-called Palestinian society, and I spent the other half of my life with the Jewish community. When I speak on the authority of experience that is representing both cultures. One culture is a culture of death that has been sacrificing children for political and financial gain. And Omar is coming here to the West, carrying the false Palestinian identity, hiding behind a couple of Western values, trying to manipulate and deceive American and Western audience by showing somebody like Hassan Nasrallah and Ayatollah and Sinwar and the rest of the proxy leaders. These people are reckless. They started the war on October 7th, and Israel had the right to defend itself. And Hezbollah has been launching missiles on civilians. They just killed 12 children as the whole world is watching on a playground. And that was Druze community, which is a great part of the Lebanese community. And no one leashed Hassan Nasrallah. How many times Omar and Mustafa's and Muhammad's complained or protested against Hezbollah aggression, taking advantage of Israel bleeding in the south.
I'm sorry.
And he was totally mistaken. Hassan Nasrallah today, this is his punishment. Israel is legitimate when I stand for Israel. Why do I stand for Israel? Because Israel is the most legitimate ethnic group in the region, with evidence, overwhelming evidence to relationship to that land.
Yeah.
Omar and the
This is not a
Muslims
serious
have been trying
conversation.
for the past 1400 years to delegitimize and annihilate the Jewish people from that land. And they hate it so much
sorry.
that
This is not a
Israel
serious
is showing
argument.
resilience and strength. You ask Omar if he's sad. Omar is
Thank you.
mourning. Hassan Nasrallah is his hero. So let me tell Omar and his lies. Listen, you cannot rewrite history. And when I speak, I don't only speak on my own authority, I speak on the authority of the universe. That Iran and all its proxies
universe.
and
You
the
speak on behalf
Muslim
of the
world
universe.
behind it.
No, this
if
is a very,
they
very
don't
serious conversation
back
now.
off, there is going to be only the language of fire. And you can sit here in the West pretending to value the Western ethics.
All right.
You are a liar with a
I'm
false
sorry.
identity
Yeah.
and your religion
All right.
and your entire population.
Let me get a
have
time.
no respect.
Let me call a timeout here. Omar, you can respond to this. I'm going to just go to the Professor Morani for a moment to get his response to this. I will come back to you. What I would say though is you did choose to start the whole debate with a quite lengthy personal attack on Mossad. It's hardly surprising
One
he
that
would
is
return the
100%
favour.
merited.
I
That's the
personally
difference.
would
That's the
prefer,
difference here.
I'd like
That's
all
the
the
difference
guests
here.
to try and
He's
talk about the
openly-
issues.
Openly bigoted. No. There's a difference between me pointing out the fact that he openly says that all Muslims are evil in comparison to animals and engages in all kinds of the worst kind of bigotry imaginable, and him just inventing nonsense and just leveling it at me. By the way, I'm a secular agnostic. I'm pretty open about that. I've written about it. I don't know what he's talking about with the Mustafas and Muhammads and whatever. Just you can see the bigotry in his engagement and about the Arab culture of death. In one breath, he says openly that the entire Arab world is made up of 300 million clowns. That is a direct quote of his. And on the other, he's feigning concern for Arabs who died because of Hezbollah. I mean, just the entire thing is just a silly charade. He's not a serious human being, and you can see the utter bigotry in every word that comes out of his mouth.
All right.
And the fact that he has no serious analysis to offer.
Okay, I want to come back to both of you and talk seriously about what is a very serious situation. It's been reported tonight that Israel is planning to launch an incursion, as they put it, a limited ground incursion into Lebanon, perhaps as early as tonight. This is obviously a massively important moment in this conflict. So let's try and talk about that when I come back. I now just want to bring in the Professor Mohammed Moran, who's been on our session before. He's currently in Beirut. Professor, thank you for joining me. First of all, do you mind me asking why you're in Beirut?
When the Israeli regime carried out a major atrocity on the first day of bombing, killing well over 500 people, I decided to come here, and I thought it would be best to be here to help be a voice for the people of Lebanon. And actually I was in the building where I was staying when the attack occurred on Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and the 6 towers, residential towers, that were all destroyed, killing hundreds of people. It was about 1,000 meters away. I know that neighborhood well because during my sabbatical in Lebanon in 2011 and 12, I lived pretty close, and I walked there and drive through there. And the Israelis massacred hundreds of people. And in the West, they don't stress that. I think there were 83 missiles, each 1 ton. And it's unbelievable how immoral the Western elite has become, that they're gloating over this attack. After a year of genocide and Holocaust in Gaza, and now slaughtering people and in Beirut day and night. After the attack on Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, hours later, they said they're going to strike 3 other places, and they struck 12 or 13 in southern Beirut. People were terrorized. No one knows how many people have died. And this is, of course, the legacy of Western colonialism and the Israeli regime, an illegitimate regime. There's a paradox here. On the one hand, they are your chosen people. On the other hand, you're a secular Western political order. We don't know what to believe when it comes to the West. On the one hand, the Israelis from Europe and other parts of the region are far less Semite than the Palestinians. They have exceptional rights. They can slaughter people, as they've done in Lebanon before Hezbollah was created. Hezbollah was created as a result of the Israeli regime's occupation of Lebanon and the taking of this very same city that I'm in right now, Beirut. It was created as a result of the occupation. And they drove the Israeli regime out. And the Israeli regime during the occupation in 1982, they and their allied militias, they slaughtered in a refugee camp pretty close to where I am right now. They slaughtered 4,000 people within 36 hours, up to 4,000 Palestinians and sub-Lebanese. So this genocidal behavior of the Israeli regime began far before Hezbollah was ever created.
Okay. Listen, I gave you a long chance there to respond because I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say, and I mean that. Hezbollah, as you know, along with Hamas, they are wedded to the destruction of Israel, and Hezbollah's response to October the 7th was to immediately unleash a lot of rockets at Israel in solidarity with what Hamas had done in Gaza. If you're the Israeli government and you've just been on the receiving end of one of the worst terror attacks of modern times, with 1,200 people killed, with nearly 7,000 more wounded, in an utterly horrific and barbaric series of attacks from up to 3,000 people coming over your border, and then the response in the north of your border is for Hezbollah to unleash a lot of rockets at you, and then to carry on doing that for the next calendar year. At what point did you not think that Israel's going to respond? And whether you agree with what they've done or not, the military success, and I'll phrase that exactly as I've just phrased it, the military success of what they've achieved against Hezbollah in the last 10 days by the pager attacks on 3,000 members of Hezbollah, by taking out now the leader of Hezbollah and many other commanders, by taking out the Hamas leader in Lebanon. You cannot dispute the military success. And what I'm curious about with Iran is, where is the response? You know, Iran helped create Hezbollah, helped train Hezbollah at the start. Iran has funded Hamas, funded the Houthis. Israel has now, if you look at this purely objectively from the outside, from a military point of view, is having a lot of success against Iran-backed groups. Where is Iran? Why is it not responding? Many people think it's because actually Iran doesn't have either the ability to take on Israel or the desire to.
First of all, I think that you have to keep in mind that, from my perspective, the Israeli regime cannot respond legitimately because the regime is illegitimate. Hezbollah wants apartheid and ethno-supremacism to be dismantled. In other words, something that in the West is very impossible to imagine. All human beings in Palestine.
Well, it wants Israel destroyed. It wants the destruction of Israel. It's literally
they want the destruction of this racist political entity that carries out genocide and ethnic cleansing, and it has been doing so for 76 years. The very same people who carried out the Nakba, they raped and murdered and expelled people. Most of the people who are in Gaza are refugees. This is not a legitimate regime.
Okay, but going back to my question, Professor, why is Iran not doing anything? The world is watching, and the world is curious.
First of all, Iran will respond, have no doubt about that, and the Israeli regime will be punished. Second of all, Iran will continue to support the axis of resistance. And Israel has not had any military success. The pagers was a terrorist attack, and it was actually an attack on the West too, because these electronic devices from now on, those things that have been produced in the Western countries that are allied to the West, their supplies chains have been compromised. And the West is doing nothing about it. And I think lots of people are going to have second thoughts about buying any electronic devices from any of these Western countries affiliated to the West. So the Israeli regime is doing no services to the West by carrying out these terror attacks.
It's interesting that you phrase it. It's interesting you phrase it as a terror attack, given that obviously, well, given that Hezbollah is identified by America and many other countries as a terrorist group, and given that it was very specific in its targeting, you know, extraordinarily precise. It is obviously horrific that civilians were killed in the process, but the vast majority of people who were damaged or wounded or killed by the pager attacks were members of Hezbollah, who are, according to America and Israel, a terror group. So that's how they would categorize it. That's not an act of terror. That would be, under the laws of combat, they would say they are taking on combatants, and that's perfectly lawful and legitimate. That is their argument.
Here's if it was pagers and walkie-talkies or cell phones that were in the United States, I think you'd have American bombers over countries who they would claim were behind it. So let's put aside the hypocrisy.
But just to be clear, you don't think that Israel has any military right to respond to Hezbollah firing rockets at Israel?
Israel does not have an ethno-supremacist regime. Apartheid South Africa had never had the right to exist, and Israel never had the right to exist. The only existence...
So it has no right to defend itself against rocket attacks?
But it has no right to exist when it came into being by displacing people and massacring.
I understand your position on its existence. I'm just telling you, given it does exist, does it have no right to defend itself?
This is what you fail to comprehend. As long as you have a master race, as long as you have a hierarchy of race, as long as you have one race that considers itself superior to others, there is not going to be any peace. That's just a fact of life. Whether it's in the United States, or whether it's in Palestine, or whether it's in South Africa, there's not going to be peace. For Iran, the dismantling, and for Hezbollah, the dismantling, or you can call it the destruction, the dismantling of this system has to happen. And this is something that you don't accept, which is fine. You support racism.
No, I don't. No, hang on. Don't misquote me. Don't misquote me. I don't dispute for a moment that is the intention of Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, all funded by Iran. I have no doubt that Iran would like to see the destruction and removal of Israel. I get all that. I'm just saying that yeah, but hang on. Yeah. I'm just saying that right now it looks like Hamas is losing, Hezbollah is losing, the Houthis are on the run, and their big backer Iran seems to have disappeared. And I'm looking at this thinking, this is odd. Where is their big backer? Where is Iran, who's been sponsoring, funding all this terror? Where are they when the real action starts? And many people think, like I said, it's because Iran either lacks the capability or the will to try and respond to what's happened.
That's what you want people to think.
No, it's what people are saying.
Well, that's
because there's been no response.
And that is a narrative that you wish to pursue, which is fine, but then you're going to be struck with reality ultimately. Ansarullah is not retreating. The Israeli regime and the Americans have failed in the Red Sea. Ansarullah survived 7 years of genocidal war backed by the US and the war government against their people. They defeated the people who carried out the genocidal work. You think a couple of airstrikes from the Israeli regime is going to change anything? They will continue to enforce, as they say, Ansarullah in Yemen, enforce the Genocide Convention. And your governments are the terror organizations. They're the ones that are funding this genocide. They're the ones giving the bombs, the bunker busters to go and bomb homes and civilian towers in Gaza. And whenever they carried out, the Western media will say Hamas strongholds, terror centers, Hezbollah strongholds. Why? Because they want to justify these terror attacks. No, the terrorists are in London and Washington and Paris and elsewhere. But since you think that somehow you're more civilized and that your countries are better than ours, whatever you do has justification. No, the terrorists are the ones who are supporting the Israeli regime and who have been carrying out terror for a year. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, they are the native population that have been brutalized for 76 years, and Hezbollah has been trying to help them. They voluntarily entered this battle last year, Hezbollah, to draw the Israeli army away from Gaza so they would be able to kill less people. They are heroes, contrary to what you say, and your government has been helping the Israeli regime to slaughter. They've been giving them intelligence, political support, financial support, ammunition, and of course the weapons they have, and most importantly, the intelligence. All of the Five Eyes, Western intelligence, and the AWACS that fly, and the drones that fly alongside the Mediterranean, both for Gaza and Lebanon, they're helping the Israeli regime carry out its genocide.
Isn't the truth about this that there's a massive geopolitical battle of will going on, where you have Iran, you have Russia, you have China dancing somewhere in the middle, and on the other side you have the West, and there's a jostling for power and position and geography. You see it in Ukraine, you see it now in the Middle East, and that Iran is sitting there in a really interesting position where it's seeing Saudi Arabia nudging ever closer to normalizing relations with Israel. And if that was to happen, after all the other Middle Eastern countries that have done that, it's pretty well game over for Iran's ability to destroy Israel and to destroy this normalization process. That's what Iran is terrified of. And that's why Iran has been so aggressively funding these groups, which I would categorize as terrorist groups, you categorize them as freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them. They've been funded and armed by Iran, who right now is looking completely impotent in the eyes of the world. Now you say they're going to respond. The last time they responded to an assassination, they fired a few hundred rockets that all got taken out by Israel's Iron Dome. It wasn't exactly a show of strength or might. And I'm not saying this to goad Iran into doing anything. I'm just saying it is notable that Iran has done nothing. And it could be that Iran itself right now is feeling very isolated and feels that maybe the net is closing in on itself.
Yes, you're very inconsistent in what you said. Right now you're saying on the one hand is Iran, Russia, and sort of China, and now you're saying Iran is completely isolated. Right? Which one is it? Let's be real here. This is not about geopolitics. That is always part of everything. This is about a moral issue. You cannot comprehend that your governments are morally inferior than others. Your governments are terror states that are supporting.
I've made no comment about that. I mean, I was the editor.
You were saying that
I was the editor of the Daily. Well, to be clear, I was editor of the Daily Mirror newspaper when we opposed the British government's war in Iraq, for example. Right, so when it comes to my moral view of these things, it may not be as simple as you think.
I acknowledge that in our first discussion, and I will not refrain from doing so again. But your government carried out the dirty war in Syria. We know Jake Sullivan, he wrote an email to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, a decade after 9/11.
What about what Hezbollah did in Syria at the behest of Assad, a dictator? What about killing hundreds of thousands of Muslims? Did you have a problem with that?
No, your governments killed hundreds of thousands of people because your government...
Hezbollah did too, with Assad's forces.
Your government...
No, you don't think that's true? You don't think it's true?
Come on, Pierce.
Come on.
Your government...
Are you denying that Hezbollah got into bed with Assad and killed hundreds of thousands of people?
You don't want me to respond because you know that this is going to be a problematic for you. Your intelligence agency in England facilitated the travel of young people to Syria to fight and to join ISIS. The same ISIS that, according to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, regional countries were deciding to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And according to General Michael Flynn in an interview on Al Jazeera of all places, he said that the United States supported this. The United States supported the rise of ISIS in carrying a leaked audio, and all of this is online. He said we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. So your governments are responsible for Syria. Your governments are responsible for Libya. Remember, we came, we saw, he died. This was a sovereign country that your government destroyed. Your government supported the genocide in Yemen, and now your government is supporting the genocide in Gaza. And the people of this region.
Would you categorize? Okay, I hear you, and you're perfectly entitled to your view. But would you agree that when you have a charter which proclaims you want the destruction of Israel, which has 7 million people living in it, that is genocide?
No, no one is talking about killing Jews. That's a lie. In fact, many
Well, if you
young
destroy Israel, you destroy millions of Jewish people.
And fortunately, the resistance in Southern Africa and their supporters across the world destroyed the apartheid regime in South Africa, but they didn't kill off the white population. Young Jews in the United States are standing up to this apartheid and racist and genocidal regime today. And the fact is that the Israeli regime has exposed itself to the world. They have done more harm to Jews than anyone else. They're the anti-Semites because they're carrying out this genocide in the name of Jews, and young Jews in your country and in the United States that are saying not in my name. So they're the anti-Semites. They're the Europeans who came here, and now Netanyahu calls Palestinians Amalek. And you know what that means in biblical terms. It was the Israeli president who said that there are no innocents in Gaza. It was the Israeli so-called defense minister, or terror minister, who said we're going to shut off the medicine and the water and the food, and we're going to stop the
shocking statements, I agree with you.
And that's what they did. It wasn't, they weren't shocking.
I agree with you. And the fact that they were able to do that.
And the fact that they're still doing it, now they want to expand it to Lebanon.
I don't disagree with you about the occupation charge, because clearly only an occupying force or country can have the ability to turn on the tap of energy and water and so on. I agree with you.
So that makes it a criminal regime, and your government, so what does that make your government? It makes it a terror regime.
Okay.
So instead of calling our governments and groups in this region that are indigenous, and all they want is Palestinians to be treated as equal human beings and to bring down this corrupt system, instead of calling them the terrorists, you should call those people who are the terrorists.
All I would say is I believe all Palestinians should have exactly the same human rights as any Israeli or anybody else. I completely believe that. But I do not agree with your categorization of these groups as resistance. They are terror groups. We'll have to disagree. Okay, he's your hero. To me, he was a despicable terrorist, but we'll have to leave it there. Professor Rankin, thank you very much for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, let's go back to the panel. I mean, Mossad, that is the Iranian view. He's entitled to have that view. It's interesting for my viewers, I think, to hear that view. What is your response?
Look, the Islamic Revolution leaders, Ayatollah, and before him, Ruhollah, they have invested some 40 to 50 years into their proxies, and that includes Hezbollah, Hamas, and other proxies in the region. Now, what they see the collapse of their aggression, the collapse and the failure of many, many years of investment. What happened to Hezbollah is shocking to the core. The entire Islamists around the world are seeing the collapse of one of the most funded, equipped military force in the Middle East. And Ayatollah is not far from Israel's reach. He understands this. This is why he retreated after the assassination of Haniyeh. And by the way, I want to ask just a question. Who killed the Iranian president to begin with? The fact that Israel did not announce that did not mean that Israel does not have any hands in it. So Ayatollah and the other Hamas leaders in Qatar who think that they are immune to retaliation, they're totally mistaken. I said this from day one, and that's based on a personal experience with Israeli intelligence of more than 10 years, that all Hamas leaders will be eliminated with no exception. Hezbollah, that was surprising to me how fast they actually collapsed. But the Iranian regime is a lot more vulnerable. And the Iranian nuclear program is ought to be destroyed. It's just a matter of time. There is no immunity for these people who have been destabilizing the region, taking advantage of the chaos they create. Then we have the clowns here, what so-called experts coming here in the West, spreading false narrative of occupation and Palestine. And what I say, Palestine never existed except as a colonial entity created by the Brits. Lived for about 25 years, a colonial entity. It was never a country, it was never a nation. And today, when Omar and his friends come and say Israel is occupying force, I say occupying what? If Palestine never existed, how can you occupy something that never existed?
Okay, let me bring in.
So now they keep on. No, wait.
I'm going to let Omar
Now
respond.
they keep going. They keep. He will have his time.
Here's the
He
thing,
will have
Piers,
his time.
right?
Now
He's
we are talking about a false narrative. We are talking about
Don't
a
talk
false
over each other.
What's
narrative.
up? You've had a chance to have your
Okay,
dialogue.
Omar, you respond now.
You're here. You're hearing Musab here talking about how occupation is all fake and made up and it's whatever. But it's incredible that when you look at what international law says, what the UN says, what the UN General Assembly says, what UN resolutions say in the Security Council, there is a complete and total consensus on the fact that Israel is an occupying power, illegally occupying the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. The International Court of Justice has come out with an opinion making clear that this occupation is illegal and has to end. So while Musab wants to pretend that this is something that Palestinians manufactured because he has nothing of substance really to say, the reality is just so obvious and so blatant that you don't even know how to address such a bizarre and ridiculous argument that this is something that Palestinians invented. Palestinians have been there for literally thousands of years. They are the natural continuation of people who have lived in that land for a very, very long time. And yes, it's true, Palestine was never an independent UN member, for example, an independent country. But by the same token, Native Americans in the United States were never also did not have a state that is a member of the United Nations. It doesn't change the fact that they were living on their own land and that colonists came and take over and rolled them off of that land and created a new state on top of them. So Israel was created at the expense of Palestinians. And while you might talk about this militant group or that militant group or what their charter may say about the destruction of Israel, in the case of Israel, it is active policy that we're watching is to destroy Palestine. This isn't theoretical. We're not talking about what their charter says. We're talking about what Israel's doing. And Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It is building illegal settlements in the West Bank, using unspeakable levels of violence against the Palestinian civilians there, and confining them to smaller and smaller areas. We are watching the destruction of Palestine before our eyes in a way that the entire international human rights community and international law says is completely illegitimate and criminal, and our reaction is to fund it and maybe occasionally criticize it instead of standing up to it in a really meaningful
And Omar,
sense.
what would
that's
you,
the double standard
Omar,
here.
what should Israel have done on October the 8th after the attack the day before?
In a theoretical world in which I was the Israeli leader on October 8th, what I would do is take on the podium, acknowledge the fact that we've created an unspeakable situation in which violence is inevitable, and I would offer to instantly end the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, to apply international law and respect Palestinian human rights in exchange for every person on October 7th who engaged in acts of violence against Israeli civilians to be brought before court and put on trial for war crimes.
And who
I
would,
think that
who
solve
would,
the
who
entire
would do
problem.
that?
But that's not the question.
Who would have brought
Exactly.
40,000
Yeah.
Hamas fighters to court?
Yeah, you don't need the entire 40,000 in the same sense that you don't need every last member of the Israeli military to be brought before war crimes because the Israeli military engages in war crimes. There is a path forward, and that's the thing. The reason
So you're
why this
seriously
is so
suggesting that
controversial
Israel should not have
is because
responded?
Israel
So
insists.
you're seriously suggesting that Israel should not have responded to one of the worst terror attacks in history in any military way whatsoever?
You have to be consistent about this, Peters. If we're expecting Palestinians to not respond in any militant sense to literally decades of Israeli atrocities and war crimes against Palestinians, why does it only work one way? Why do we say that Israel must respond militarily, but Palestinians are never said to need to respond militarily to decades of Israeli occupation or war crimes? Why is that double standard there?
Because the argument, as you know, from the other side, is if you go back to 1948, that there have been a series of escalations in those 75 years, with blame being attached to both sides, small things happening, which then trigger outbreaks of war. And it's gone on now for 75 years, and at the centre of it is an ongoing. But here's my point: the centre of it is an ongoing dispute about territory and land. I get all that, but ultimately, you cannot have a situation where on one day that volume of people are massacred and wounded. It's 7,000 people wounded, and that Israel just does nothing. It was so far and away beyond anything anyone had seen in that conflict for 75 years in one day. Of course they were going to respond. Of course Hamas knew. Of course Hamas knew that would be what Israel would do. So they knew what would happen to their own people, and they didn't care. Iran knew what the response would be, and obviously knew what Hamas were going to do. Hezbollah's reaction was not to show a modicum of sympathy for any of the people killed. It was to launch a barrage of rockets in sympathy with Hamas, the terrorists who perpetrated it. And they carried on doing that all year, for a whole year, and they displaced 70,000 Israelis from the north of Israel. And at some point, of course, Israel is going to respond. Now, what part of what I just said is factually inaccurate?
Yeah, I think the entire framing that Israel is responding is at the fundamental core of what's
I'm not denying historical. I didn't look the reason I prefaced it by saying I said there would be 75 years of flare-ups and wars and everything, and you can argue about all the history as long as you want. What you can't argue with is the scale of what happened on October the 7th was so horrific. It was always going to get a massive
major attack.
Sorry?
Yeah. No, here's the thing, Piers. This is not about tracing it back as a tit for tat. Well, they did this before, and those people did this before. There is a status quo. It's not equal sides that are living on both sides of a border that are perfectly living fine and equal, and then one of them chooses to launch an attack against the other. You have a fundamental status quo in which one people rules another, in which Israelis every day, decade after decade, are free and living complete freedom and democracy and so on. And you have Palestinians in Gaza who are living in a cage, not allowed to go in and out, have no freedom,
but
have
Hamas
no
were
economy,
given governmental
have no airport,
power. Yeah, but hang
have
on.
no prospect for a
Hamas
better
was
future.
given governmental power from 2005, and all it did was spend billions of dollars building a huge underground tunnel network so it can continue to wage terror against Israel. They squandered that money. When you can argue till the cows come home, but that's obviously what they did, and they did it at the expense of their people. So yeah, you can claim with great cause, by the way, that Israel's had an occupation which should never have been permitted in the first place. But you can also not deny in 2005 they pulled out of Gaza and let Hamas take charge, and this is where we've got to. How does that help the people?
I don't think that's a correct framing. No, they withdrew in 2005 out of Gaza and then put Gaza under siege and made it a cage. And allowed Hamas to govern this cage internally. They can be the prison wardens of Palestinian prisoners. That's not meaningful governance. And then you can have a serious debate about how Hamas spent its money. You can say that maybe what they should have done is make this cage a little bit more pleasant for Palestinians to live in, and instead they chose to devote their resources into breaking out of that cage by investing in military infrastructure. I'm not a fan of Hamas. I don't support them. I oppose their rule. I don't think they're a particularly positive influence on Palestinian society. At the end of the day, when you're talking about a captive population that Israel has just put in a cage and left to rot, it is natural that people are going to be drawn to more extremist and violent ideologies in order to break to that fundamental injustice.
But do you accept
That's really the reality.
Do you accept that you have the three H's, the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, all describe terror groups to many nations around the world, all of them funding Israel's supply of oil? And do you accept that at some point, when you have that kind of concentrated collection of groups that are wedded to the destruction of Israel, Israel is going to do what it can to try and save itself, right? You can argue about the history as much as you want, but they're going to do that. And what is inarguable, it seems to me right now, what I put to Professor Moran, is that from a pure military perspective, it would appear that Israel is having enormous success now in taking on Hamas, Hezbollah, now the Houthis, and Iran has disappeared. Iran is doing nothing to defend these groups that is funded for so long.